So welcome to episode number 2 of Ask a Developer on the Spawncast network. And for those people that are new to Ask a Developer series, this is a particular Q&A session where you guys ask me questions about anything that's kind of pertinent in the video game industry with regards to development of games, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. Now, I will give you the disclaimer that anything that is under NDA, I will respectfully decline and say I can't answer that question due to NDAs. But for the most part, we'll try to get through as many of these questions as we can. But let's go ahead and start with the questions now. And we've got a lot of them to cover because obviously there was the LRG3 announcement that happened a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, my involvement in that got a lot of people really excited to learn more about some of the things that we're doing there. But let's go ahead and jump in. And the first question is from DC Fat Cat, and he asks something of a rhetorical question, but do you think of loading screens as a crutch for poor memory management? Back in the day when engines couldn't support a graphics stream, it made sense. Nowadays in 2023, shouldn't most games be without loading screens? Well, this is a good question, DC Fat Cat. I think, yeah, I mean, you're right. Loading screens kind of traditionally were there to essentially kind of free out all the resources of the current level that was being played, and then kind of bring in new data, new assets from, you know, the storage medium, whether that is the CD drive or the hard disk. But yes, it was there pretty much just to, you know, keep the memory allocation where it needed to be for these games. 2023, should we continue to have loading screens? I think we'll start to see loading screens become less pertinent over time. But, you know, we're kind of still in the situation where we're very much still kind of in the middle of the PS4 generation and the middle of the PS5 generation, if you know what I'm saying. Like, there is still a lot of emphasis on games that are built with Unreal Engine 4, for example. There's also a lot of, you know, smaller games that use Game Maker. There's also, you know, hardware like the PlayStation 4, which is still very, very popular. I mean, if you look at any, or not any, but most game announcements these days, there's still, I would say probably about 6 out of every 10 will have a PlayStation 4 version available. So we still have to kind of continue to support that legacy. And with these engines such as, you know, UE4, those things will always continue to have, you know, loading screens and things like that. But I will say that I feel like, at least my instincts say, that loading screens, due to the, you know, introduction of SSDs in the generation, will get a lot faster and faster, to the point where we may not even notice them, you know, into maybe next generation, for example. That's definitely something that I'm seeing happening, and it's something that I definitely would like to see. But very, very good question, DC Fat Cat. And the next question is also from DC Fat Cat, and he asks, just in case someone doesn't ask, but how censored is the content in Gex 2? Well, for those people that may not be familiar with what DC Fat Cat is referring to, the Gex trilogy was announced at LRG3 to be running on the Carbon engine, and that's obviously something that I'm working on. Unfortunately, DC Fat Cat, this question kind of gets to the NDA area of the conversation, and I can't answer that. But here's what I will say, and it's just a blanket response, and that is, look, I'm a fan of the Gex trilogy, of the Gex games. I want to try to make everyone happy with what we're trying to do. So other than that, I can't really say too much more. But thanks for the question, and we'll definitely, you know, take it on advice. Now, Bench JC asks, I hear Carbon engine a lot, but what is it and what's so special about it? Well, it's a internally developed engine that we've built at Limited Run Games that allows us to bring back old retro games from, you know, years and years ago, right? And bring them to a modern audience across all the current generation of consoles, including the PC. Now, essentially, at its core, if we kind of dig deeper and kind of peel the layers off, we're talking about building emulators. Now, this can either be in the form of emulation that we've built internally. So, for example, we've developed emulators for Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, NES, and others. But we've also licensed existing emulators out there, and we've basically brought them into the Carbon engine as well, as these engines that we can provide to our customers. Now, what does this mean to the end user? Well, it means what we saw at like Limited Run Games 3, for example, where we saw games that are pretty obscure or you really haven't heard about for a very long time. Games such as Clock Tower for the NES, or the Super Famicom, I should say, coming back. We've got games like Tomba and the Gex Trilogy, games that you would be really surprised to be thinking about when you're thinking about games coming back. The Carbon Engine essentially allows us to offer those experiences back to you guys. And the other thing I might add with the engine is that it takes advantage of modern consoles. It runs on all platforms: Switch, Sony, PS4, PS5, Xbox Series, and PC. It also takes advantage of, the particular hardware-specific items such as trophies and achievements and 4-player controllers and the Joy-Cons and all that sort of stuff. So it's essentially just a very curated emulation experience to bring back retro games to a modern audience with really cool quality of life. I know that probably was maybe a little longer, but hopefully that answers your question. Now, the next question is from Vrang807, and they ask, what programming languages are most AAA games made from? Some version of C or something obscure? Vrang, the common programming language is C++. Now, a lot of developers still kind of have a mix of C and C++, but essentially any modern development kit that you use with the SDK that you're provided with, the expectation is that you'll be using Visual Studio 2019, and they will install a C++ compiler for you. So C++ is the language that is most commonly used. Now, there are differences there. Of course, there are other programming languages that do use different languages, but if we're talking about AAA development, then we're talking about C++. Now, Captain Kid asks, what's something you wish we had the technology to implement into current games, but we can't due to technical limitations? Our biggest limitation for me is getting a solid locked 60 frames per second across the board. So we can't just, spin up a new game and say we want to target 60 frames per second and achieve that goal. There has to be a lot of work that gets optimized to potentially hit that mark. And as we've seen, many games, even though they target 60, they don't get there. So I think there needs to be some new technology. And I know that there's a lot of really interesting things going on now with things like reconstruction and frame insertion and things like DLSS that really does help with performance. But essentially what I would really like to see is that if you start building a game and you say, I want it to run at 60, then it should just run at 60 no matter what. And I think we're still a long, long way away from that. Now, Brandon Wells asks, you said that you put different engines into the Carbon Engine software when making a game. How long does it take to develop an engine? For instance, if you were to make a Sega Saturn engine, how long would that take? And is it just one or two people developing that? Well, Brandon, the answer to that question is it can vary. Now, if we're basically in a situation where we have a new game that requires a new engine, that we have to make a decision. And that essentially is kind of build versus buy. Do we take the time to build our own internally, or do we just license an existing engine out there, or an existing emulator? Now, many emulators out there have, very, very favorable open source licenses where you can license those emulators, but some of them don't. They're closed source, or they have non-commercial license agreements and things like that. So the real answer is it's very hard to answer that because we would have to make a determination. But I would say for Sega Saturn, because of the complexity of that emulation, we would potentially look at licensing an existing one. But even if we did, we would still have to take the time to get that into the Carbon Engine. So we would have to port all that code across and make it something that the Carbon Engine can understand. So there's still a lot of time that needs to happen there as well. Now, Tony Palmieri asks, the Carbon Engine seems like a great option to port in classic games. Do you know if it would aid in getting more Sega Saturn games ported to modern systems? Because the game community, I'm sure, would like that. Well, I'm a big fan of the Sega Saturn, and nothing would please me more to see Carbon Engine games, or to see Sega games running on the Carbon Engine, the Sega Saturn games running on the Carbon Engine, I should say. At this making of this episode, we don't have Sega Saturn support in the Carbon Engine, and that's simply because we don't have, currently at least, a requirement to do so. But hopefully that will change, and we'll hopefully start to see Sega Saturn games coming via the Carbon Engine in the future. But we'll see what the outcome there is. Now, Demolition Man 5 asks, after the recent report from the Video Game Historical Foundation that 87% of classic games are unavailable to the average consumer, do you believe that the Carbon Engine in the future can become a tool to preserve those games and maybe allow playable access to anyone with a web browser? Look, I think, as someone that is a big proponent of preservation, of course, I think offering physical products of video games, with complete physical products, not something that requires a download or whatever, is always a good thing. For example, Switch cartridges, even though they have security around them, they can certainly be dumped and preserved. So I think that's always a good thing. Now, I'm not sure about playable via web browser. We haven't really talked about branching the Carbon Engine out beyond game consoles and the PC, but the future is always interesting. There's always different needs and different niches out there that want to play games in different ways. So look, I will say this, I wouldn't necessarily rule out that we one day wouldn't get the engine running on a web browser, but at the moment it's really more about just bringing commercial games back. So I think at this time at least it's not something that's on our roadmap. Now, Medallion asks, I saw RGT's video this morning. That's not even a question. He said, I saw RGT's video this morning talking to MVG about the Carbon Engine and thought he accidentally posted a video for the Patreon to his main channel instead. Well, yeah, check out RGT85's video. We had a really good chat about all things the Carbon Engine. He actually asked some really good questions. So for those people that do want to learn more about it, check out RGT85's video about the Carbon Engine. We're going to do a couple more here before we finish up for today. Mo Beast Gaming asks, if you were starting a career change now, what would you do to get into the game development industry? I've made one Game Boy style game, learning C++ online and learning Unreal now. Well, I've always said, Mo Beast Gaming, that in order to kind of, differentiate yourself from everyone else that has probably developed at least one small Game Boy style game, has a GitHub page and is learning various engines out there, that you really have to be a little bit different in how you kind of advertise yourself. If I was you, I would use YouTube as something that I would potentially start to, take advantage of. And what I mean by that is, if you start to kind of put a brand around who you are, then that's something that people can look at and say, this guy's really smart and, he knows what he's talking about. Try to kind of advertise yourself. Don't be afraid to kind of put yourself out there. The Game Boy style game that you were talking about, make a video on it, talk about it, put it out there on Twitter, hashtag game dev, and someone may notice it and you may get some likes and you may get some followers. I think if you start to really kind of put, a brand around who you are, then I think that's a really good way to kind of get recognized and, get it into the gaming industry. Now, Blake Merritt asks, hello, not necessarily Carbon Engine related, but why do most games have motion blur turned on by default when it seems like the best way to play most of the time is with it turned off? This is a great question. I will say I'm not a fan of motion blur at all. And usually when I start a game, I go straight into the graphics options and disable motion blur immediately. I don't like it. Now, why do they have it turned on by default? Some people really like motion blur, and I think maybe the majority wins in this situation, so maybe it stays. But I'm with you, Blake. I personally am not a fan, and I usually turn it off pretty much immediately. Now, Maui asks, and I'm sorry if I butchered your name, what's the simplest way to explain what a game engine is? Thanks to MVG and the rest of the Spawncast crew for amazing content. Now, I did actually record an answer to what a game engine is, but I ended up listening back to it and I kind of just threw it away because I think the best way to describe what a game engine is to kind of show you an example. Now, this is Unreal Engine, and we've just got the standard third-person template. Now, I will say that I am not an expert when it comes to Unreal Engine, but basically what a game engine does, it allows you to make games. Now, that sounds a little obvious, but it's really designed for you to quickly prototype and get kind of a game up and running without you having to worry about writing lines and lines, hundreds, maybe thousands of lines of code to acquire or to get the same result. So for example, if we take a look at this scene here, you can see that we've got a couple of cubes that are on the ground here. We've got this kind of little kind of play area sandbox. We've got some shapes, some 3D models. We also have a skybox that's in the background, and we also have a kind of a main character. Now, I'm able to control this with a mouse and keyboard, and the other thing that a game engine really does help with is that this game will run on any target that supports UE5. And you can see here that we've got Android, HoloLens, iOS, Linux, iOS, Windows. Now, the console-specific ones aren't here because you need to get it, obviously, you need to get approval and a license to use those. But if you had a license to run UE5 on, say, the Xbox, then you would have a target here for Xbox. Now, interesting things about Unreal Engine that I do want to point out is that you can see here as we kind of run around the scene, and I've added some additional cubes to the scene, you can see that there is physics, there is gravity, there is collisions, and all those types of things have already been built for you out of the box. And I will tell you that if you were to construct your own game engine that did all that stuff, you would be probably spending a couple of years to achieve the same results. Maybe not a couple of years. If you were a skilled programmer, maybe you could kind of do it in about 12 months. But building an engine that can manage a 3D game or a 2D game can take a very long time. And I also want to point out that not every game engine is equal. So for example, the Carbon engine that we've been talking about on this episode is not a public-facing engine. It doesn't have a pretty interface like Unreal Engine. But what it does do, it allows you to spin up a vertical slice very quickly of an old retro game that the Carbon engine supports. So we use the Carbon engine not only to build our games, but we also use it to, to send to potential partners that want to work with us and show them what the engine is capable of and how it runs. And this is a very, very powerful thing. Most game engines out there, whether they're either public-facing or internal, and when I mean internal, I'm talking about things like the Northlight engine that Remedy uses, or the Red engine that CD Projekt Red uses. Those engines are not public-facing, of course. The Carbon engine is another one, or the Kex engine by Night Dive Studios is an internal engine. But at the end of the day, the whole goal of a game engine is to help you building games and to take away a lot of the work that you'd have to worry about when it comes to kind of building out these lower level systems. Now, of course, something like Unreal Engine doesn't have everything out of the box. A lot of the systems that does work with Unreal Engine were developed internally, or they could be purchased on the UE store. So hopefully this goes a long way to, describing what a game engine is. Even something simple like Game Maker or Game Builder Garage on the Nintendo Switch, you could technically argue that that is a game engine as well. Not only does it allow you to kind of basically play other people's creations on the engine, it also has it's not a fully fledged 3D world or a 2D world, but it has enough tools for you to kind of build out your own games. It obviously does have its limitations, being a smaller product that came out for the Nintendo Switch, but it has many of the concepts to making video games that even something as complex and advanced as Unreal Engine 5 does out of the box. So hopefully that does answer your question. I know I kind of went a little longer, but I really did want to kind of sit down and talk about this in some more detail. Noah Smith is the last question, and they ask, what would be your dream franchise to develop a game for? I think I would probably like to do something with either Silent Hill, even though that's already been done by Blooper Team, but I would Definitely love to get involved with Silent Hill. I think that's always been a kind of dream of mine. As well as Metroid. I think Metroid is a really cool franchise that I'd love to be involved in. And, being on maybe the development team of Metroid Dread or Metroid Prime 4, I think that would be really cool. I'd love to get involved in something like that. So that's the last question that we had for this episode of Ask a Developer. Once again, this is on the Patreon. If you want to ask a question on the Patreon, I'll be happy to answer them in the following episode. But we're going to leave it here for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. Have a good one.